action to impact the COVID virus, is kind of a model for what we have to do for climate change. Is that we need bold, drastic, and we're not there yet. So that's obviously what we're trying to get at. So I don't know, that was just one way they kind of linked the two, is how, I mean, for very obvious reasons, people see the immediacy of this need, or most people, hopefully more are, of addressing this right now, and the hope would be that we could get them to feel that way about climate change as well.
Yeah, I've been on a couple of clean and ecos calls where what Tom was saying is definitely what a lot of other folks were saying, is that there's some object lessons coming out of this for being able to deal with some of the climate related crisis we may be looking at coming up. I think definitely one thing that's come out of it is it seems like for the past 4 years, we've seen a push towards a sort of circle the wagon mentality of some of the populist movements in various governments. And it's kind of like, nope, that's not going to work for this one.
I was going to say, I was in a workshop the second week of March. It was a week-long workshop with artists and cultural leaders from US and Canada, and it was put on by Julie's Bicycle out of the UK. And one of the things, we kind of shifted things in the middle of the week to talk about COVID and how we could respond in times of crisis. So I put a link out there on the chat about a document that we put together on responding in times of crisis and responding in a just way, because we really talked about how it's a wake-up call of things to expect in the future, that it's not going to hit everybody equally, and we're seeing that right now with a lot of people that have basically lost their income, and artists are a big part of that right now too. They can't perform, and so they're not being paid, and all the people that support the arts and the sports and everything like that. So I think if you look at it in terms of a wake-up call, then as you guys said, in the different conversations I've heard so far, maybe we can put things in place to realize that, things like this are going to keep happening in the future. And maybe we can, if we respond to it correctly now, we can position ourselves better.
Did anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I just think that, the idea is adding on to what Betsy was saying. I guess Frank and Tom kind of implied the same thing, and that is that these kinds of things are going to happen, like whether or not this one is connected to climate change because the pangolins or the bats or whatever needed extra, place to be, and that's how come they were crowding into our area, whatever, our area, whether or not that has any basis in this time around. There are, possibilities of worse, other, not necessarily worse, but just other diseases being released, for example, from the permafrost, as the permafrost melts and things like that. So definitely this is a wake-up call in how to work as a world, and I think that's one of the things. The other thing is, one of the ways to put the point about some people are getting cleaner air and some people are getting outside more, is to talk about it not, like obviously, always point out how many people have been hurt by this thing, but also point out that when climate change brings hurt, the ways that we address it can bring co-benefits, like clean energy is going to do what COVID-19 did without hurting anybody, it's employing people instead of not employing people, might be one way to put it.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I think the other addition, James, did you want to share?
Well, no, go ahead. I will say something, but it's not like I'm jumping to say something. So please go ahead. I'm learning and listening to you and everyone than I've got something brilliant to say about this.
I actually lost my train of thought. So if you want to share.
Oops. Well, okay. Well, what I was going to say was first kind of that the connections between COVID-19 and what's going on and the climate change, obviously a very important subject, a big subject, and I really want to take in what people have thought about it more and a lot to say. I don't want to change the subject, but there's also clearly also the subject of us working together and learning and connecting and supporting each other. Most of us, maybe all of us, have to adjust heavily because of the changes, right? Not whether we're in school volunteers, whether we're in the outside world, whether we're teachers, we're students, everybody is adjusting. And, how are we learning from each other on how we do that?
Yeah, that's a nice connection to where I was trying to steer the conversation next is, what are the positive aspects? We touched on some of these things, getting outside or, in this process, we're going to take away a bunch of learnings. So one, maybe having new digital resources or having new virtual networks. So if you can come up with any other positive things that you might see coming out of this, I'd like to hear them. But also thinking about how can this inform our ideas about equality or justice, and how do we support people in marginalized communities right now, either regarding COVID or regarding climate change? I wonder if anyone has any thoughts.
Yeah. One thing that I would like to say is, and this is from me following social media accounts from a lot of Indigenous voices, coincidentally, like was spoke about in the book, about how there's a certain narrative that it's sort of not like the mainstream, but being pushed out, how COVID-19 is sort of bringing about ecological changes that are for the benefit, but Indigenous voices are really challenging that and saying, well, yes, but the way that the benefits are framed as if it's saying that the humans are problems, whereas a lot of Indigenous people that see on social media say that no, it's not that humans are part of the problem. It's humans are part of their nature, and right now they're a part of their nature in a way that's sort of throwing nature out of whack. And if we can become a part of nature again, in that we cooperate with it and sort of care for it and nurture it, then we could see all those benefits without all the negative effects of COVID-19 happening.
Yeah. Thanks, Isam. Did anyone want to add thoughts?
I've been reading a lot about native peoples and indigenous peoples and attitudes and so on, and a bunch of essays in a book called Original Instructions, put out by, I think it's put out by the Pioneers, but just a whole lot of people have in those essays, they're all by indigenous people, and they always point out that same thing. And they point out that there are certain ways, like institutionalized ways, that they have created to make it, to make their decision making reflect what's going on in the environment. I mean, they'll appoint a person whose job it is to come to meetings and represent the trees or the river or whatever. And there's people who are there to represent the mothers and and somebody else for the children, and so on. So that those people are thinking, on down the line. And another one is that when you have the only thing that really matters, and this really, I think, is important. I don't know whether it just relates to climate conversations, and that is, the idea that clear thinking exists, the possibility for clear thinking exists in all of us. And there was a person called the Peacemaker who said that if you believe that your enemy cannot think clearly, you have deprived yourself, you've destroyed your own ability to make peace with them. So what they would do is in any meeting, they would have somebody who, when someone states a position, somebody wanted to speak in opposition to it, would have to explain the original position that the person said to their satisfaction before they would say their part. So it's just a whole bunch of, real practical things that could be done in our government, in our social institutions, the ones that we're creating, right?
I see that. I see those examples of how do we represent cultural value in policy, and how do we bring that voice in? And I think Indigenous communities are better at that than other communities. But I wonder, to push us away from just thinking of Indigenous folks as the only marginalized people, like how has COVID has changed my understanding of what marginalized is. In the COVID conversation, it's people who don't have access to internet that are marginalized. I don't know, Tom, you said you're a social worker. Is that correct? Does this come up in your work at all, of these conversations?
Yeah, I'm a social worker in St. Paul schools. And yeah, I mean, definitely, in terms of seeing, people who are marginalized, it comes up all the time, but I do think, like, even right now with every school in Minnesota, at least, looking at distance learning, and I will admit, like, and I'm not at all even in charge at all about how that's been rolled out. And I'll give the district a lot of credit in that, like, to some level. I kind of thought of it, I hadn't thought of it. Like, yeah, not everyone has. At least in St. Paul, every kid, in theory, not in theory, in reality, will have an iPad from the district, but not everyone has internet or whatever. So, what's good there, at least I believe Xfinity for the 2 months is going to give free. But I guess my point is yeah, there's a lot of things I think we all take for granted. Or I shouldn't say we all. I know that I take for granted, that other people don't necessarily have or don't think about. Or even, like, for me, my wife and I feel pretty lucky that, I can work from home. And my wife, she works for Children's Hospital, she can too. But there are a lot of people where, don't get me wrong, I think everyone should be staying home, but it's a hell of a lot easier for me when I'm still going to be getting a paycheck, as for someone who's like, no, my business is now going to likely end, or, whatever. So, and that's, regardless of your ethnicity or whatever, it's just a whole different level of privilege.
Thanks for sharing.
One thing I thought about all of this is that marginalized communities, which, I don't want to act like that's not real, that when I put quotes around it, but just taking them all together, if you look at these communities, they are not the ones who are saying, oh, climate change, it's all over with. They're not saying that. They're used to this. And they're used to fighting back and organizing. And it's not, it's one more thing than they're used to.
Yeah. It's hard to understand why maybe underrepresented groups aren't outspoken. Nadia, did you want to share about that?
Yes, I'm here in the Pearl Valley. We have the Pearl Climate Action Group, which is Regeneration, and we focus on migrant groups, and we have community organizers who go out and work with them, because when the migrants who are out in the field are exposed to climate, weather change, and the pesticides. So we've been focused on heat stress of migrants in the field here, and meeting with them in small groups and discussing what the experience is, what kind of health issues they have, and what their income, how they've been affected with the income, and if anything happens, who is responsible for their needs, and who takes over the work that they do. So this is, at this time with COVID, having access to transportation, whether they can go to the fields or not. So that will be an additional issue that we have to, cover and address and see what we can do at this time. And they have families and children who are in school, so they're also been affected financially and otherwise.
So do you view your role as being an advocate for them? Or what do you view your role as with the relationship?
We focus on social justice at Regeneration, and we do a lot of community outreach And so we always out trying to educate the local citizens on what they can do every day and what to help them in understanding what climate change is. So because we also have a language issue also here, so we have to be conscious of that, and also economic as well. Not everyone is very low income, so you have to be conscious of whether they'll be willing to accept what climate change is and whether they'll be to take part in it. So it's growing and it's changing. So we do a lot of community outreach, and since Earth Day is now canceled, that was one of the events we take part in, and teach the community what we do and what is going out in the Marrow Valley itself, and what issues that we can help them with and change.
Great. Do any of the other people on the call that work in nonprofits have stories of how they might advocate and support underrepresented groups in their work? Climate Generation has, we try as much as we can. You know, we have an equity policy that we've written and developed over the last year, and we have a board of directors that helps us think about equity issues and climate justice and guides our programming. But I would say, if I could give you one word about our view and strategy, is we try to uplift voices that are consistently pushed down by the system in a certain way, or not represented in the system because there might not be enough people to represent them. So we really try to uplift stories, and that's how we advocate for people in our work. But I think this is a good time to transition maybe to talking about the book, unless anyone else wanted to share last thoughts about COVID climate connections. Cool. Okay. I recognize that not everyone would have read this book prior to. So is there anyone that's willing to give a brief synopsis of the book? Maybe Isam, because it seems like you read it, to the group.
Yes. So basically what a brief synopsis is, so it's a future future world set in Canada, in a world that was impacted by climate change. And because of climate change, people who are not indigenous, they lost the ability to dream at night. So what they did was they set up schools in certain areas so that they can take people from the indigenous community into those schools, so they can extract basically dreams from those indigenous people from their bone marrow, hence the title. And you have the main characters who are a family trying to head north to a place where they feel they can find some solace away from the recruiters of the schools. So on their journey, they encounter recruiters that they try to escape from, and they also encounter more native indigenous folks who can either be traders or who will be more friends, and they sort of seek to build a community among one another. I don't know. Yeah, that's basically what I got.
That's great.
Yeah.
Was there anyone else that was able to read the book or listen to the author talk prior to the meeting? Yeah, so a few people. Okay, I put a link in the chat box to an author talk that's hosted by St. Paul Public Library, so you can watch that after. The author, Cherie Dimaline, is amazing. She has Indigenous heritage. She speaks really eloquently about climate justice and social justice from an Indigenous perspective. Like, her opinions will really change your opinions, I think, in ways that are unexpected. So did anyone else want to share something about the book in synopsis form? No major takeaways. Great. So one thing that I think Isam didn't touch on was maybe this idea of how what we've been talking about, of how climate change disproportionately affects different groups of people, and or maybe affects people in different ways, let's say. So in this book, both non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities have been affected. It's just about the way that they respond is very different, and the way that their lives are changed fundamentally by these changes. And I think the author does a really good job of communicating the Indigenous perspective. And a lot of what Lucy was talking about as Indigenous peoples wanting to represent the earth and spirits and different cultural identities, and that not necessarily being true of non-Indigenous folks in this book. And I think the way that the author writes about that is really interesting. Did anyone else, that this will be a hard conversation to have if I'm just talking my ideas, but so is anyone else interested in sharing their thoughts about Indigenous representation or ways of climate change affecting people?
Yeah. So one thing I would like to mention that sort of touched with me when near the end of the book was how the indigenous community, as they were moving to find new lands, they wanted to go back to where their home was. And even when it was noted that that home was poisoned because of either industrial activity or because of subsequent climate change, they still harped on going back to that home and saying that, well, this is our home, and if we basically have the knowledge we have, so we can take care of that land and basically rejuvenate it from that poison state to something that can be sustainable and lively again. So that was one thing that sort of stuck with me as I was reading the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed is when I was in that workshop, we had a person from the Hopi Nation that shared with us, and he was a dryland farmer, and he brought an ear of Hopi corn that he grows, and he was talking about how important it was to him, and that basically his whole culture is wrapped up in that ear of corn and what he does in his livelihood of being able to farm, being able to deal with drought in times of climate change, and how he's just trying to be resilient and moving forward. And I asked him, since my program, we work a lot with schools here in Tucson where we're doing rainwater harvesting. We're doing passive rainwater harvesting at schools and trying to grow shade to mitigate the heat that we have by growing native trees. And I was really interested in the type of water harvesting that he's doing. And I said, do you have anything that I can share with my students? And he's like, no, we're not going to share it. We're not going to share our culture. And so that kind of brought me back to this book, because people tend to take advantage of that indigenous culture and that indigenous way of knowing. And I've seen this too with a friend of mine that works for ARCUS, the Arctic Research Consortium out of Fairbanks, where they work with a lot of scientists that work in indigenous Arctic communities. And she's been really instrumental in having workshops where they bring together the indigenous voice and the scientific voice. And what they've really done is orchestrated or create an architect plan of working in indigenous communities and having this voice and this knowledge as part of the project to begin with, so that people that are affected or understand this are helping create that scientific question and helping with the research that way. So I think it's a matter of not grabbing indigenous knowledge or grabbing the bone marrow from these people. It's a matter more of creating a collaborative environment where we can learn and work together and move forward in whatever project that we're working on.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. And I liked how you touched on the metaphor and of extracting bone marrow or taking dreams from people and instead of collaborating and building something together. If I can just take a moment, I can read a section. Actually, I highlighted the section that perfectly demonstrates what you were talking about in the book. So this is just a few paragraphs. I think it's in the middle of the book. And this is the Indigenous elder that's sharing story about what has happened to the earth and how people are responding. So I'll just read this part. The earth was broken. Too much taking for too damn long, so she finally broke. But she went out like a wild horse, bucking off as much as she could before lying down. A melting north meant the water levels rose and the weather changed. It changed to violence in some cases. Building tsunamis, spinning tornadoes, crumbling earthquakes, and the shapes of countries were changed forever. Whole coasts breaking off like crust. And all those pipelines in the ground, they snapped like icicles and spewed bile all over forests, into lakes, drowning whole reserves and towns. So much laid to waste from the miscalculation of infallibility in the face of a planet's revolt. People died in the millions when that happened. The ones that were left had to migrate inward. It was like the second coming of the boats. So many sick people and not enough time to organize peacefully. But the powers that be still refused to change and bent the already stooped under the whips of a schedule made for a population twice its size and inflated by the need to rebuild. Those that were left worked longer, worked harder, and now the sun was gone for weeks at a time. The suburban structure of their lives had been upended, and so they got sicker, this time in the head. They stopped dreaming, and a man without dreams is just a meaty machine with a broken gauge. People lost their minds, killing themselves and others, and even worse for the new order, refusing to work at all. They needed answers, solutions. So up here, the governors turned to the church and the scientists to find a cure for the missing dreams. In the meantime, those who could afford it turned to sleep counselors, took pills to go to bed and pills to wake up, and did things like group hypnosis to implant new dreams. At first, people turned to indigenous people, the way the New Agers had, all reverence and curiosity, looking for ways we could help guide them. They asked to come to ceremony. They humbled themselves when we refused, and then they changed on us, like the New Agers, looking for ways that could take what we had and administer it themselves. So I feel like she does a very good job there, connecting to real life, but also connecting to the idea of reaction to emergency rather than inclusion and community from the beginning, which I think has some strong correlations to maybe what we're seeing today.
Yeah. And then one thing that I also wanted to mention was, like it was said, this concept of taking from indigenous people, the concept of taking physically the bone marrow for the dreams, and going back to how in a quest of after the destruction, the society wanting to rebuild instead of working on basically the internal, like the inherent symptoms that cause the breakdown, and going back to the old stories that were being told for that society, and not changing those stories to fit a new reality that was happening, or not changing those stories in time to change the way that they looked at the world. And the reason why I go back to stories is because a lot of times narratives are what is sort of like viewpoint where we look at the world, like the narratives that surround us, basically give us a way to interact with the world. And if we have narratives of keep taking that the earth will just regenerate itself, and then it will just lead to a path of destruction where there'll be nothing to come back from.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that. I don't know if anybody here reads Bell Hooks, but I've been reading her recently, and she talks about the idea of the servant and the served, and more in sort of like a feminist and race way. But what you're talking about, Assam, with like that narrative is, I think, for a lot of white people, speaking for myself, but then also sort of like, you know, the sort of anybody in the oppressor class, and that can look like a lot of different things in a lot of different scenarios. There is this narrative of the servant and the served, which is that, you know, some people are here to give us things, right? So like that, I think Betsy was talking about the indigenous person who wouldn't share their growing practices, right? And I think that reminds me of bell hooks, because it's this idea that indigenous people have always been here to serve us, and that they give us the resource or the growing practice when it benefits us, and then we can push them away. And I think like I think one of the things that hearing you all talk about the book that's sticking with me, what I remember when I read it, was that it's this idea that like the indigenous people in that book could see the land, and they could see their space as one whole place where they could care for, which is totally antithetical to like a capitalist perception of land, which is a place to make money, and a capitalist perception of people, which is people to make the money, right? And like when you have that capitalist focus, you lose sight of the entire land and the entire space, and that land and space as a living, breathing thing, and then that makes the abuse of it easier.
Great, thanks, Andrew.
That whole idea with the capitalist thing too is interesting, because it's playing out right now with trying to bring the economy back. Do we bring the economy back at the, you know, at the risk of losing I forget how many lives, 800,000, 8 million lives, whatever it is. You know, it's the whole thing, keep taking, but what's the price of that?
Yeah. So we have a few minutes left to talk, and I wanted to talk more broadly, bring it up a little bit higher level about using literature, maybe in this specific instance, to bring these ideas of capitalism, let's say, into the classroom. Is anyone using, or is anyone an English teacher? Is anyone using literature in their classroom? Yeah, right now. Do you have any specific tips for people or guidance on how to use literature to talk about climate change or big issues in climate change?
Yeah, I kind of had a breakthrough because I had that same question, and I read I think y'all might have done this a few months ago, Hour of the Bees. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I read that with my 7th grade students, and they really enjoyed it. And I was going back and forth, like, how do I address it? How do I make sure it's understandable and not super scary? And then I just realized that like talking about climate change, I had to think about it like a skill, just like we spend time in the classroom talking about grammar or about vocab or about structuring a paragraph. And when I thought about it more as like a skill and not like an ideology, it became less intimidating for me to teach. And I was able to wrap my head around, all right, well, if knowing about climate change skill, what would be the first thing to know? And then that kind of led me down sort of, just in terms of a teacher, that led me down like a natural path of developing lessons and developing questions and developing assessments. And especially having, you know, reading a whole novel that like Hour of the Bees or The Marrow Thieves that has a climate change sub-narrative or main narrative to it, those conversations can come up a lot more naturally. And then it doesn't really feel forced or like it's out of left field, or it's like, it's just my kind of wacky idea. This seems more natural that way.
Yeah, thanks for those insights.
This is Tiffany. I just wanted to thank Andrew for talking about it that way, like a skill, because I feel like not only is part of our outreach to support teachers about supporting generally what they're teaching in their curriculum, but it's also about giving kids insights into future careers for themselves. And it doesn't matter where climate fits in or where sustainable practices fit in. It's that lens of not only how we live our lives, but being a steward of our planet, and also the context of a skill that's going to carry them into their future career. And I think Andrew having that insight about it being a skill is a really, really great way to help teachers who think, oh, it's controversial, or I'm going to have climate denier parents email me about this, or whatever it is, because sustainability is truly a skill, and it's something that can be an overlay into almost anything we teach. And I think that's a really important way for teachers to think about it.
Thanks, Tiffany. I feel the same way. Andrew, that was great insight. Did anyone else have any thoughts?
I just want to say that I think it's important when you're thinking about sustainability to really think deeply about it, because the way that Indigenous people are thinking about it, in a certain sense, whatever you can learn from from the writings there, because sustainability, when I have studied it at the, I took a class from OSU, online class about sustainability. It was all about, there were 3 parts to it. The triple bottom line, and 2 of them were human. It was like we're double as important as all of Earth. And so I think when we go in talking about, oh, there's skills, there's sustain, not to fall into creating the exact same thing that we've got today, but with a green overlay to it. So that, I think that's a skill also that has to be, we have to think about it definitely deeply.
Yeah, also
Go ahead, Nadia.
Also, when teaching the kids, I think they want to know the reasonings why we're focusing on climate change, and what's this great issue and interest now. And for the younger kids in elementary, it's an elementary state of mind for them, where they're not exposed to it if their family are not part of the culture that we're educating on climate change. So that also can distance them from taking part and seeing a future in it. So my job is to encourage them and teach them the basics until they're grasping what it is that we're doing and why we're focusing on climate change or environmental solutions within the community at a local level, rather than thinking broadly. I think when you have communities where they're not part of the overall, is to think of a localized education on climate and environmental solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia.
And if I could speak from a student's perspective, I feel like a lot of times, even if, especially students who are more focused on humanities and the arts, and that was me for a long time before I did eventually choose environmental science. It sort of seems like the conversation on climate change doesn't pertain to them. Like, they don't have a voice in drawing out solutions and doing things that could help mitigate and solve the issue of climate change. So with literature being brought in, and to a certain extent arts and films overall, it meets just those students exactly where they are, and can show them like different ways in which they can work in order to solve this issue, whether through activism or through the art they create, or through stories that these creative children or these creative people tell. Because just speaking from a student perspective, it's sort of like we know about climate change, but a lot of times we are helpless, especially those humanities and art students, in which they say, I think I don't have the skills in order to help solve or mitigate the issue.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Climate Generation, especially this year, is making a lot of efforts to work on, I guess I don't want to say pitching, but making the claim and actually showing teachers that climate change education is interdisciplinary, and teaching the social aspects is incredibly important, especially when we talk about solutions, because the solutions oftentimes are deeply steeped in social understanding of self and relationships to the earth that we've talked about. And then also when we come to policymakers are representatives of people. So, and people make decisions not necessarily always on data, but on emotions. So, understanding how people relate to these things is very important. So I see that Julia just joined us. We're actually ending the meeting here in just a moment. So I hope you didn't get your time changed or mixed up. So I'm really happy that you guys are all here today. I really value all of your insights, and I hope that you got something from this conversation. This recording will be hosted on our YouTube page. And I also wanted to share a couple other things with you before we go. We are hosting a webinar tomorrow at noon Central Time to talk about resources that we put together for virtual climate change education. But I'm going to let you guys in on the blog that we wrote, which I'll put in the link here. And that blog has everything in it that will be in the webinar. So if you can't attend the webinar, just read through those resources. And there's social studies resources, climate justice resources, primarily ELA and science represented. And then next month, I have a date for our meeting next month. Although we're sort of keeping the theme in the air at this point, we're going to be talking about a new book that we have coming out called Eyewitness, which will be released on Earth Day. And it's a collation of people's eyewitness accounts of climate change in their lives through art. So it's poems, short stories, and pieces of art. And we're going to share selected pieces with you to read prior to the meeting. And then we'll talk about those and talk about virtual Earth Day events, I guess. Yeah, I expect at that time we'll all still be participating in virtual learning. So let me just get you the date for that. Sorry, don't have it up. I wasn't prepared. So that will be April 27th at 7 p.m. Central Time. Great. So we're a few minutes over time. Thanks everyone for being here. Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
By the way, hi, Lucy.
Yeah, hi. Go ahead.
I've been meaning to contact you to catch up. So, but I don't want to. That's after the meeting. After we talk, disrupt the talk with messages. That's great. Thank you so much for hosting this. I think maybe the COVID has allowed, at least in my case, that to open up a little bit, to have more time for things like this. And so I probably, it didn't get into my radar. So I'm so glad. I mean, that's actually a benefit of this, to actually connect with these hangouts. That's really great.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, so I had asked if we're reading something for next month. What is the readings from Eyewitness?
Oh yeah, sorry. So this book is going to be published in the next week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's really new, and we won't be able to get copies mailed out to people fast enough. So what we're going to do is take selections out of the book from a PDF and share them individually.
Cool.
And so I was planning on emailing them to the Teach Climate Network email list.
I don't know if I'm on that, so I'm going to type my email in right now.
Okay, perfect.
Do you know who's the author?
Yeah, so this is a partner project that Climate Generation has created. And what we did is we went to people and helped them generate poems and art and stories about their eyewitness accounts to climate change and their personal experiences.
Cool.
So there's students, farmers, hunters, politicians, authors represented.
Sweet.
Yeah, it should be pretty cool.
Great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So we'll try to get those out to you in the next 1.5 weeks, I think.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, thanks for all your insights. That was great.
Good. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.